the unlikely act of generosity, how a white woman changed a young black man's life forever. The sun was setting over the small southern town, casting long shadows on the dusty streets. The air was thick with the tension that simmered beneath the surface, a tension that had been building for years, fueled by the unspoken divide between black and white. It was in this town, with its history of segregation and simmering racial hostility, that young David was born into a world of fear and uncertainty. David's early life was marked by tragedy. His parents, both proud and determined people, had fought to make a life for themselves in a town that was not always welcoming to those who looked like them. His father, a hardworking black man, had earned a modest living as a carpenter, while his mother, equally strong and resilient, worked as a seamstress. They were devoted to each other and to their young son, David, who was the light of their lives. But the world was not kind to those who dared to dream beyond the confines of what society deemed acceptable. One fateful night, as David's parents were returning home from a rare night out, tragedy struck. A group of white men, fueled by hatred and emboldened by the town's unspoken rules, decided to make an example of David's father. They ambushed him on a dark road, beating him mercilessly while his mother screamed for mercy. Her cries fell on deaf ears, and in the chaos, a gunshot rang out. David's father was left bleeding on the ground, while his mother, in her desperation, tried to shield him with her own body. In the struggle, she too was struck down, her life snuffed out in an instant. The town, known for its indifference to the suffering of its black residents, turned a blind eye to the tragedy. The police, all white, made a cursory investigation and quickly closed the case, labeling it a robbery gone wrong. There were no arrests, no justice, only a deep, aching void where David's parents once stood. David was just a boy when he lost his parents, too young to fully understand the magnitude of his loss, but old enough to feel the weight of the world crashing down around him. With no one else to turn to, he was taken in by his grandmother, Miss Etta, a woman of great strength and wisdom who had seen more than her share of hardship. Miss Etta was a survivor of the Jim Crow era, a time when black people were treated as second-class citizens, denied basic rights, and subjected to constant humiliation. She had worked as a nurse for many years, tending to the sick and dying in a segregated hospital where black patients were given the bare minimum of care. Despite the challenges, Miss Etta never lost her dignity or her faith. She knew that the world was harsh, but she also believed in the power of love and resilience. When David came to live with her, Miss Etta took it upon herself to raise him as best she could. She taught him the values of hard work, perseverance, and compassion. She told him stories of their ancestors, who had endured slavery and fought for freedom, and she made sure he understood the importance of education as a means of rising above the limitations placed upon them by society. But even as Miss Etta did her best to shield David from the harsh realities of the world, she knew that there were some things she could not protect him from. The town's racial tensions were always simmering just beneath the surface. And as David grew older, he began to see the world for what it truly was, a place where the color of his skin made him a target for hatred and violence. One hot summer day, when David was just 12 years old, The tension in the town reached a boiling point. David was walking home from the market, a basket of groceries in his arms, when he heard raised voices coming from the town square. Curious and cautious, he edged closer to see what was happening. A crowd had gathered, mostly white, their faces twisted in anger and disdain. In the center of the crowd was a black man, someone David recognized from church. The man was being confronted by a group of white men, their voices loud and menacing. They were accusing him of something. David couldn't make out what, but it was clear that the situation was dangerous. "Get out of here, boy," one of the white men shouted, shoving the black man roughly. The man tried to defend himself, raising his hands in a gesture of peace, but the crowd was having none of it. They were out for blood, their hatred boiling over into violence. Someone threw a punch, and then another, until the man was on the ground, trying to shield himself from the blows raining down on him. David's heart pounded in his chest as he watched in horror. He wanted to help, to do something, but he was just a boy, and he knew that if he stepped in, he might be next. He felt a hand on his shoulder, and when he turned, he saw Miss Etta standing behind him, her face a mask of sorrow and determination. "David, come away," she said quietly, her voice filled with a sadness that cut through him like a knife. "There's nothing we can do here." David hesitated, his eyes fixed on the scene before him. The man on the ground was bleeding, his cries of pain mingling with the jeers of the crowd. It was a sight that would haunt David for the rest of his life. Miss Etta gently pulled him away, leading him back home. As they walked, she spoke to him in a low, steady voice. "David, this world can be a cruel place, especially for people like us. But you must remember, no matter how hard it gets, you must hold on to your dignity. Don't let the hatred of others turn you into something you're not." David nodded, though he didn't fully understand. How could he? He was just a child, thrust into a world that seemed intent on breaking him. But Miss Etta's words stayed with him, a lifeline in a sea of confusion and fear. That night, as David lay in bed, he couldn't sleep. The image of the man being beaten played over and over in his mind, and he felt a deep, burning anger in his chest. He wanted to do something, to fight back against the injustice, but he didn't know how. All he could do was clench his fists and swallow the tears that threatened to spill over. The days that followed were a blur of fear and uncertainty. The town was on edge, the tension between black and white residents thicker than ever. David felt it everywhere he went, in the way people looked at him, in the whispers that followed him as he walked down the street. He was no longer just a boy, he was a target, a symbol of everything the white townspeople feared and hated. Miss Etta did her best to protect him, but even she couldn't shield him from the harsh reality of their situation. She taught him how to keep his head down, how to avoid trouble, but she also taught him to be proud of who he was, to never let anyone make him feel less than human. "David," she would say, "you are a child of God, just like everyone else. Don't ever forget that. No matter what they say, no matter what they do, you hold your head high and walk with pride." David tried to take her words to heart, but the world around him made it difficult. Every day was a battle, and the weight of it all pressed down on him like a heavy stone. He missed his parents, missed the life they had before everything went wrong. But he knew there was no going back. All he could do was move forward, one step at a time, guided by the wisdom of the woman who had taken him in when the world had abandoned him. The next time David walked through the town square, he did so with a new awareness. The shadows seemed darker, the faces of the people more hostile. He could feel their eyes on him, judging him, despising him for the color of his skin. But he also felt something else, a resolve deep within him, a determination to survive, no matter what the world threw at him. He didn't know it then, but this experience would shape him in ways he couldn't yet understand. It would be the fire that forged him, the crucible that turned a scared, lost boy into a man with a purpose. And it all started on that hot summer day in a small southern town where the line between black and white was drawn in blood. Miss Etta, David's grandmother, had lived through some of the darkest days of the Jim Crow era. Her memories of that time were etched deep into her soul, shaping the woman she had become and the values she instilled in David. As a young black woman in the South, Miss Etta had faced unimaginable hardships. She had worked as a nurse, caring for both black and white patients, though the treatment she received often depended on the color of her skin. Her eyes, once bright with the hope of youth, had witnessed the cruelty of segregation and the constant threat of violence. One evening, as the sun set behind the cotton fields, Miss Etta shared her stories with David. They sat on the porch of their small home, the wooden boards creaking beneath their weight. The cicadas hummed in the background, filling the air with a steady, rhythmic sound. "David," Miss Etta began, her voice tinged with both sadness and pride, "there was a time when I wasn't allowed to sit where I pleased, to speak my mind, or even to look a white person in the eye without fear of retribution." David listened intently, his young mind trying to grasp the harsh realities his grandmother had endured. Miss Etta continued, her eyes distant as she recalled the past. "I was a nurse during some of the worst times. I saw black men and women beaten, humiliated, and denied basic human dignity. But I also saw the strength in our people, the way we cared for each other, the way we fought to survive." She paused, her voice softening as she looked at David. "I want you to remember this, child. No matter how hard it gets, no matter how much they try to break you, you are strong. You come from a long line of fighters, and you must carry that strength with you always." David nodded, his heart heavy with the weight of his grandmother's words. He understood that his struggles were part of a larger, ongoing fight for justice and equality. Miss Etta's stories fueled his determination to rise above the circumstances of his birth and make something of himself. So, later that week, David finds himself in a perilous situation. After school, he is walking home when a group of young white men, their faces twisted into sneers, spot him. "Hey boy, where do you think you're going?" one of them taunts. David quickens his pace, his steps echoing on the cracked pavement. The group follows him, their jeers growing louder. "Get back here. We don't want you around here." David's breath comes in ragged gasps as he races through the narrow alleys, his heart racing with fear. He ducks behind a stack of crates, his mind racing with thoughts of his grandmother and the dangerous world outside. The young white men eventually give up the chase, their laughter fading into the distance. David, trembling, makes his way home, his resolve hardened by the encounter. He knows that this is not just an isolated incident, but a glimpse into the harsh realities of his world. At home, David tries to mask his fear from Miss Etta, but she can see the distress in his eyes. As he sits at the dinner table, his hands tremble while he pushes his food around his plate. Miss Etta, her voice filled with concern, asks, "What's troubling you, David?" David looks up, his eyes brimming with unshed tears. "It's nothing, Grandma. Just some boys from school." Miss Etta's eyes narrow with worry. "You know you can tell me anything, child. This world is hard, but we have to stay strong." David nods, but the fear gnaws at him. He feels the weight of his grandmother's expectations and the burden of living in a world that doesn't seem to want him. The injustice he sees around him is overwhelming, and he struggles with the need to stay strong while grappling with his own sense of hopelessness. David's first encounter with Mrs. Grace was serendipitous. He was on his way home from school, his worn-out shoes kicking up dust as he walked along the side of the road. He had just passed the edge of town when he noticed an elderly white woman standing beside a car with a flat tire. Mrs. Grace, a woman in her late 60s with silver hair and kind blue eyes, was clearly in need of help, despite the racial tensions that hung heavy in the air. David's instincts drove him to offer assistance. He couldn't ignore someone in need, no matter their skin color. David approached cautiously, aware of the potential consequences of interacting with a white person. "Ma'am, do you need help with that tire?" he asked, his voice respectful yet firm. Mrs. Grace looked at him, surprised by his offer. In that moment, she saw not just a young black boy, but a kind and capable human being. "Why, yes, I could use some help," she replied, her voice warm with gratitude. David set to work, his hands moving deftly as he replaced the flat tire. Mrs. Grace watched him closely, impressed by his skill and his quiet determination. When the job was done, she thanked him sincerely, handing him a crisp dollar bill, a small fortune for a boy his age. David hesitated, knowing that accepting money from a white person could lead to trouble. But Mrs. Grace insisted, pressing the bill into his hand. "You've earned this, young man," she said, her eyes meeting his with genuine respect. "Thank you for your kindness." As David walked away, he felt a strange mixture of pride and fear. He had helped someone in need, but he also knew that interactions like this could draw unwanted attention. Yet, deep down, he felt a connection with Mrs. Grace, as if their paths were meant to cross. After their encounter, Mrs. Grace couldn't stop thinking about the young black boy who had helped her. She had seen something special in David, an intelligence and drive that reminded her of her late husband, who had been a teacher. Mrs. Grace knew that David's potential was being stifled by the limitations of his environment, and she felt a deep urge to help him. Mrs. Grace began making inquiries about David and soon learned about his difficult circumstances. She discovered that he lived with his grandmother, Miss Etta, in a modest home on the outskirts of town. The more she learned, the more she felt compelled to do something meaningful for this young boy. One afternoon, Mrs. Grace paid a visit to Miss Etta's home. The two women, one black and one white, sat together on the porch, the tension of their different worlds lingering between them. Mrs. Grace spoke first, her voice soft yet determined. "Miss Etta, I've come to talk to you about David," Mrs. Grace began, her hands clasped in her lap. "He's a bright boy with so much potential, but I'm worried that he won't have the opportunities he deserves in this town." Miss Etta listened carefully, her face unreadable. She had seen too many promises broken by white folks to be easily swayed. But there was something in Mrs. Grace's voice that made her pause. Mrs. Grace continued, her eyes earnest. "I want to offer David a scholarship to attend a good school, one where he can receive the education he needs to build a better future. I've already made arrangements with a school up north that would be willing to accept him." Miss Etta felt a lump in her throat. The thought of David leaving was both terrifying and exhilarating. She had always wanted more for him, but the idea of sending him away to a place where he might face even greater challenges was daunting. "Why would you do this?" Miss Etta asked, her voice tinged with suspicion. "Why would a white woman like you care about what happens to a black boy like David?" Mrs. Grace's eyes softened, and she reached out to take Miss Etta's hand. "Because I believe in justice, Miss Etta, and I believe that every child deserves a chance, regardless of the color of their skin. David has the potential to do great things, but he needs the right opportunities to make that happen. I want to help give him that chance." Tears welled up in Miss Etta's eyes as she realized the sincerity of Mrs. Grace's words. It was a rare thing to find such kindness in a world filled with so much hate. With a deep breath, she nodded, giving her blessing for David to accept the scholarship. David's journey northward marked the beginning of a new chapter in his life. The scholarship allowed him to attend a prestigious school where he excelled academically and socially. For the first time, he was surrounded by people who saw him for his talents and not the color of his skin. After years of hard work and dedication, David graduated with honors and went on to attend college. Throughout his education, he never forgot the kindness of Mrs. Grace or the strength of his grandmother, Miss Etta. Their influence shaped his desire to give back to the community that had raised him. Upon returning to Crestwood, David was determined to make a difference. He used his education and connections to establish Grace's Hands, a nonprofit organization dedicated to helping underprivileged Black youth access education and opportunities. David's organization quickly grew, becoming a beacon of hope in a town still grappling with racial tensions. Grace's Hands provided scholarships, mentorship programs, and educational resources to children who might otherwise be forgotten by society. David's leadership and vision inspired many, both Black and white, to join the cause. The organization's impact was felt not just in Crestwood, but throughout the region, as more and more young people were given the chance to build better lives for themselves. The years passed, and David grew older under the watchful eye of Miss Etta. Her wisdom and strength guided him through the turbulent waters of a racially divided town. But the weight of the world was heavy on Miss Etta's shoulders. The years of struggle, both personal and shared with her community, had taken their toll. One cold winter evening, after a particularly harsh day filled with the bitter reminders of the world they lived in, Miss Etta fell ill. David, now a young man, watched helplessly as the woman who had been his rock, his guiding star, began to fade away. "David," Miss Etta said weakly one night as he sat by her bedside, "you are stronger than you know. This world, it may be harsh, but you must never lose hope. Promise me, David. Promise me you'll carry on." David could barely hold back his tears as he grasped her frail hand. "I promise, Grandma," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. But despite his promise, Miss Etta's passing left a gaping hole in David's heart. The grief was overwhelming, and for a time, he felt lost, unsure of how to move forward without the woman who had been his entire world. The town's racial tensions only seemed to grow worse, and with Miss Etta gone, David felt more vulnerable than ever. One particularly dark night, not long after Miss Etta's funeral, David found himself in a dangerous situation. A group of young white men, emboldened by the rising racial hostility in the town, targeted David as he walked home. They taunted him, their words dripping with malice. When he tried to walk away, they blocked his path, their intentions clear. "Where do you think you're going, boy?" one of them sneered, pushing David back. Another man, with a sinister grin, added, "You think you're safe now that your old hag's gone? Think again." David's heart raced. He could feel the tension in the air, the danger looming closer. He knew he had to stay calm, but his mind was flooded with fear and anger. Just as the situation was about to turn violent, headlights suddenly flashed in the distance. A car pulled up, and out stepped Mrs. Grace. "That's enough," Mrs. Grace shouted, her voice firm and commanding. The men hesitated, recognizing the woman who had a respected place in the town, despite her unconventional views. "You boys should be ashamed of yourselves. Get out of here before I call the sheriff." Reluctantly, the men backed off, casting David one last hateful look before they disappeared into the night. David, shaken but unharmed, looked at Mrs. Grace with a mixture of surprise and gratitude. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice trembling with the remnants of fear. Mrs. Grace sighed, her expression softening as she approached him. "David, you have to be careful. This town, it's not always kind to those who are different. But you're stronger than this. Your grandmother saw that in you, and so do I." David, still reeling from the encounter, nodded slowly. He knew Mrs. Grace was right, but the pain of losing Miss Etta still gnawed at him, making it hard to see a way forward. Over the following months, Mrs. Grace took on a new role in David's life. She wasn't trying to replace Miss Etta, but rather she sought to honor her memory by continuing the work she had started. She saw potential in David, a spark that could ignite something greater, and she was determined to help him realize it. "Your grandmother believed in education," Mrs. Grace told David one day as they sat together in her parlor. "She knew it was the key to a better future. I want to help you, David. I want to make sure you get the opportunities you deserve." It was then that Mrs. Grace revealed her plan to arrange a scholarship for David. She had connections in the nearby city, people who could help David get into a good school, away from the suffocating environment of their small town. But David was hesitant. "I don't know if I can do it," David admitted, his voice tinged with doubt. "I don't know if I can leave everything behind." Mrs. Grace looked at him with a mixture of compassion and determination. "You can, David, and you must. This town has taken so much from you, but you have the power to rise above it. Your grandmother would want that for you." It wasn't easy, but with Mrs. Grace's unwavering support, David eventually agreed to take the leap. The scholarship she arranged was more than just financial support. It was a lifeline, a chance to escape the shadows of his past and build a future filled with promise. As David excelled in his studies, he began to understand the depth of Mrs. Grace's generosity. She wasn't just helping him out of pity. She genuinely believed in his potential, in the possibility that he could one day make a difference in the world. Years passed, and David graduated with honors, but he never forgot where he came from, or the people who helped him along the way. Inspired by Mrs. Grace's kindness and Miss Etta's resilience, David founded Grace's Hands, a nonprofit organization dedicated to helping underprivileged youth achieve their dreams, just as he had. As Grace's Hands grew, so did David's influence. He became a powerful figure in his community, a beacon of hope for those who had lost their way. And through it all, he carried with him the lessons of two remarkable women, one who gave him life, and the other who gave him a future. In the end, David stood as a testament to the power of compassion and the enduring legacy of those who choose to make a difference. Miss Etta's strength and Mrs. Grace's generosity lived on in the countless lives that David touched through his work. David reflected on the journey that had brought him here. He knew that without Miss Etta and Mrs. Grace, he might have become just another casualty of a cruel and unforgiving world. But instead, he had become something more, a man who had turned his pain into purpose, and who now used his power to lift others up, just as he had been lifted. As he gazed out at the city skyline, David felt a deep sense of gratitude. He had lost much, but he had gained even more, and he knew that the legacy of Miss Etta and Mrs. Grace would continue to shape the future for generations to come. Thank you so much for sticking around till the end of today's video. Please hit the subscribe button to stay updated on all our latest content.